Tonight we will explore the extraordinary world of Renaissance art, one of the most celebrated and most transformative periods in the history of Western civilization. As you relax and unwind, you will hear 100 fascinating facts about the painters, sculptors, and architects who reshaped the visual world of Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries, the remarkable patrons who supported their work, and the ideas and techniques that made the Renaissance one of the most creatively extraordinary periods in the history of human achievement. There is no need to stay awake for every detail. Simply listen, rest, and let the world of the Renaissance gently guide you towards sleep. The word Renaissance means rebirth in French, and the term was applied retrospectively by later historians to the period of cultural transformation that swept through Europe roughly between the 14th and 17th centuries, during which scholars, artists, and thinkers deliberately sought to recover and to build upon the artistic and intellectual achievements of ancient Greece and Rome that they believed had been lost or suppressed during the medieval period that preceded their own era. The concept of the Renaissance as a distinct historical period was first articulated systematically by the Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt in his influential work The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, published in 1860, and Burckhardt's framing of the period as a moment of fundamental transformation in the European understanding of the individual and the natural world has shaped the subsequent discussion of the Renaissance in ways that remain influential, despite the significant revisions that later scholarship has made to his specific arguments and his specific periodization of the cultural changes he described. The city of Florence, in the central Italian region of Tuscany, was the primary birthplace and the primary driving force of the Renaissance in its earliest phase, and the specific combination of commercial wealth, civic pride, humanist learning, and competitive artistic patronage that characterized Florentine culture in the 14th and 15th centuries created conditions more favorable to the development of a new artistic vision than those available in any other European city of the period. The specific wealth of Florence derived primarily from the international wool and banking trades, with Florentine banking families, most famously the Medici, controlling the flow of capital across much of Western Europe and accumulating fortunes sufficiently large to finance the most ambitious artistic commissions available anywhere in the world. The combination of this commercial wealth with the civic culture of a republican city-state, in which the display of cultural patronage was a primary means of demonstrating social prestige and political legitimacy, gave Florentine artistic production a specific character of competitive ambition that drove the development of new formal and technical solutions with a speed and a consistency that more stable and more hierarchical societies could not replicate. The painter and architect Giotto di Bondone, who worked in Florence and across northern Italy in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, is generally considered the first great artist of the Renaissance, and the founder of the tradition of naturalistic figure painting that would be developed by subsequent generations of Florentine and Italian painters across the following 2 centuries. Giotto's revolutionary achievement was to replace the flat, stylized figures of the Byzantine pictorial tradition with figures that appeared to exist in a convincing 3-dimensional space, whose bodies had genuine weight and volume, whose faces expressed specific human emotions, and whose movements and gestures were those of actual human beings engaged in specific human situations, rather than the generalized symbolic poses of the Byzantine convention. The specific quality of human presence and psychological depth that Giotto gave to his figures, most completely realized in the frescoes of the Arena Chapel in Padua, completed around 1305, established the fundamental direction that Italian painting would follow for the next 2 centuries. The Arena Chapel in Padua, also known as the Cappella degli Scrovegni, which Giotto decorated with a complete cycle of frescoes between approximately 1304 and 1306, is generally considered the most completely realized and the most perfectly preserved of all his surviving works, and the single most important monument of the earliest phase of the Italian Renaissance. The chapel was commissioned by Enrico Scrovegni, a wealthy Paduan merchant, apparently as an act of penance for the sins of usury associated with his father's money-lending business, and the frescoes with which Giotto decorated its interior walls cover the full narrative of the lives of the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ in a program of extraordinary completeness and compositional sophistication. The specific quality of the narrative in Giotto's frescoes, the way each scene communicates its human and emotional content with an economy and a directness that goes considerably beyond the requirements of straightforward. The religious illustration established a standard for narrative painting in fresco that remained a primary point of reference for Italian painters for more than 2 centuries. The competition held in Florence in 1401 for the commission to create new bronze doors for the baptistry of San Giovanni, the ancient octagonal baptistry adjacent to the Florence Cathedral, is generally considered one of the most consequential artistic competitions in the history of Western art, not only because of the quality of the works it produced, but because of its role in initiating the specific competitive culture of Renaissance artistic production that would drive the development of Florentine art across the following century. The competition required the 7 finalists to produce a bronze relief panel depicting the sacrifice of Isaac, and the 2 surviving competition panels by Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi are now displayed in the Bargello Museum in Florence, where they can be compared directly in a way that gives one of the most instructive illustrations of the specific qualities that the competition's judges were assessing and the specific formal differences between the 2 most gifted artists of the early Florentine Renaissance. Ghiberti won the commission and spent the following 20 years creating the first set of bronze doors, and subsequently another 20 years creating the second set, the Gates of Paradise, that Michelangelo would later describe as worthy of the entrance to heaven. Filippo Brunelleschi, the Florentine architect and sculptor who lost the baptistry door competition to Ghiberti in 1401, and who subsequently devoted his energies to architecture rather than to sculpture, is generally considered the inventor of the system of mathematical linear perspective that became one of the most fundamental technical achievements of the Renaissance, and one of the most consequential intellectual contributions to the subsequent development of Western art, science, and visual culture. Brunelleschi's demonstration of the perspective system, which he conducted around 1420 using a mirror and a painted panel of the baptistry of San Giovanni, that allowed viewers to compare the painted image with the actual building reflected in the mirror, established a systematic method for representing 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional surface, based on the mathematical principle that parallel lines appear to converge toward a single vanishing point on the horizon. The theoretical codification of this system in the treatise On Painting by the humanist and architect Leon Battista Alberti, published in 1435, made it available to a wider audience of artists and scholars and established it as one of the foundational intellectual achievements of the Renaissance. The sculptor Donatello, who was the dominant figure in Florentine sculpture during the first half of the 15th century, and whose work exercised a profound influence on the development of both sculpture and painting across the entire Italian Renaissance, achieved in his career a range of formal and expressive innovation that has led many scholars to consider him the most significant and the most original sculptor between the ancient world and Michelangelo. His marble Saint George, carved for the Guild of Armourers and Swordsmakers, and originally placed in a niche on the exterior of the Church of Orsan Michele in Florence around 1415, established a new standard for the representation of the heroic male figure in sculpture that reflected the humanist interest in the dignity and the potential of the individual human being, and the shallow relief panel beneath the niche showing St. George killing the dragon demonstrated the technique of schiacciato, or flattened relief, that Donatello developed to achieve a quality of spatial depth and atmospheric recession in shallow carved stone that had no precedent in the history of sculpture. The Medici family of Florence, whose rise to political dominance of the city in the early 15th century and whose sustained patronage of art, architecture, and scholarship across more than a century of cultural leadership, made them the most important single family in the history of the Italian Renaissance, built their position of cultural authority through a combination of genuine aesthetic enthusiasm, political calculation, and the specific conviction that the investment in art and learning was both personally rewarding and politically indispensable for a family whose wealth derived from commerce rather than from the hereditary nobility that dominated most other European societies. Cosimo de' Medici, who became the effective political leader of Florence in 1434 and who remained the dominant figure in the city until his death in 1464, was among the most generous and most discerning patrons of the early Renaissance, supporting the sculptor Donatello throughout his career, financing the building of the Church of San Lorenzo and the Medici Palace in Florence, and establishing the Platonic Academy that became the primary institution of Florentine humanist learning in the second half of the 15th century. The humanist movement that provided the intellectual foundation for the Renaissance was centered on the recovery, the study, and the application of the texts and the values of ancient Greek and Roman civilization, and the specific conviction of the humanists that the study of the ancient world offered the most reliable guide to the full development of human potential in the present, gave Renaissance art a specific relationship with antiquity that distinguished it fundamentally from the medieval tradition it replaced. The recovery of ancient texts through the systematic search of monastic libraries for forgotten manuscripts, through the influx of Greek scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, and through the development of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s that made the rapid distribution of recovered texts possible, provided the intellectual foundation for the humanist program and gave Renaissance artists direct access to the specific ideas about beauty, proportion, and the representation of the human figure that ancient thinkers had developed and that provided the theoretical framework within which their own investigations of these problems could be conducted. The painter Masaccio, who worked in Florence in the early 1420s and who died at the age of approximately 27 in 1428, was, despite his very short career, one of the most important single figures in the history of Renaissance painting, achieving in the few years of his active career a synthesis of Brunelleschi's perspective system, Donatello's understanding of sculptural volume, and Giotto's commitment to naturalistic human expression that established the foundation on which the entire subsequent development of Italian painting was built. His fresco cycle in the Brancacci Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, painted in collaboration with the older painter Masolino around 1425, demonstrates at full scale the specific formal qualities that made his work so immediately and so permanently influential, the figures rendered with a convincing sculptural mass and weight, placed in a space organized by the mathematical laws of linear perspective, and expressing the specific emotional content of their narrative situation with a directness and a specificity that Giotto had pioneered, but that Masaccio brought to a new level of formal and psychological completeness. The painter Fra Angelico, the Dominican friar who worked in Florence in the first half of the 15th century, and whose paintings combined the technical achievements of the early Renaissance with a quality of spiritual devotion and luminous beauty that has made him one of the most universally loved of all Renaissance artists, was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1982 and is venerated in the Catholic Church as the patron of artists. His most celebrated work, the cycle of frescoes decorating the cells and corridors of the convent of San Marco in Florence, painted in the late 1430s and 1440s under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, gives each of the approximately 50 monastic cells a single small fresco of a specific devotional subject intended to provide the monk occupying the cell with a focus for meditation, and the combination of the fresco's extraordinary formal beauty with their specific devotional function gives the San Marco convent one of the most spiritually compelling environments created by any artist of the Italian Renaissance. The sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti, who spent nearly 50 years of his career working on the 2 sets of bronze doors for the Florence Baptistry, achieved in the second set of doors the Gates of Paradise, completed in 1452, one of the most technically and artistically ambitious works of sculpture produced in the entire history of the Renaissance. Combining the illusionistic space of the perspective system with the formal richness of gilded bronze in a work of such extraordinary quality that its reputation has never significantly diminished across the nearly 6 centuries since its process. Completion. The 10 large square panels of the Gates of Paradise each depict a narrative from the Old Testament in compositions of extraordinary spatial complexity and figure density, using the technique of graduated relief figures closer to the viewer rendered in higher relief, figures further away rendered in progressively shallower relief to create an illusion of deep pictorial space within a relatively shallow carved surface that represents the most complete integration of the new perspective science. With the traditional medium of bronze relief available in any surviving work of the period. The painter Paolo Uccello, who worked in Florence in the middle decades of the 15th century, and who was described by his contemporary Giorgio Vasari as someone so infatuated with perspective that he worked through the night on its problems while his wife called him to bed, produced a body of work in which the investigation of the formal possibilities of the perspective system takes precedence over the naturalistic representation of the human figure in ways that give his paintings a distinctive quality of this formal abstraction that distinguishes them from the more humanistically oriented paintings of his Florentine contemporaries. His 3 large panels depicting the Battle of San Romano, painted for the Medici Palace in the 1450s and now divided between the Uffizi in Florence, the National Gallery in London, and the Louvre in Paris, use the formal language of perspective to organize a complex military scene in a way that subordinates the human drama of the battle to the formal pattern created by the lances, the horses, and the fallen figures arranged across the picture surface in a configuration that reflects his obsessive engagement with the geometric possibilities of the new spatial system. The painter Piero della Francesca, who worked primarily in the small central Italian town of San Sepolcro and for the court of Federico da Montefeltro at Urbino in the second half of the 15th century, is now considered one of the supreme painters of the Italian Renaissance. Though his reputation declined sharply in the centuries following his death, and was only fully restored in the 20th century, when the mathematical precision and the luminous stillness of his work were recognized as qualities of the highest artistic significance, rather than symptoms of provincial limitation. His most celebrated surviving work, the fresco cycle depicting the legend of the True Cross in the Church of San Francesco in Arezzo, painted between approximately 1452 and 1466, combines a complex, multi-scene narrative program with a quality of formal organization and spatial intelligence that demonstrates his complete mastery of the perspective system and his ability to use it not simply as a technical device for representing space, but as a fundamental element of the pictorial meaning of the composition. The court of Federico da Montefeltro at Urbino, which Federico, the physically distinctive one-eyed Duke of Urbino, whose profile portrait by Piero della Francesca is one of the most immediately recognizable images of the Italian Renaissance, made in the second half of the 15th century into one of the most intellectually and artistically distinguished courts in Europe, represents the specific character of Renaissance cultural achievement at the level of the small Italian principality as clearly as Florence represents it at the level of the large commercial republic. Federico's court attracted major artists, architects, musicians, and scholars from across Italy and beyond, and the specific intellectual and aesthetic environment that he created, documented in the famous dialogue The Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, which described the ideal of the educated, culturally accomplished gentleman that became one of the most influential texts of Renaissance civilization across Europe, gave Urbino an importance in the history of Renaissance culture entirely disproportionate to the modest size and resources of the small duchy. The architect Leon Battista Alberti, who is often described as the first universal man of the Renaissance, an architect, painter, sculptor, musician, mathematician, linguist, philosopher, and athlete of extraordinary range and accomplishment, wrote the foundational theoretical texts of Renaissance art in the 1430s and 1440s that provided the intellectual framework within which subsequent generations of Renaissance artists understood and articulated their own practice. His treatise on painting, published in 1435 in both a Latin version addressed to scholars and an Italian version addressed to practicing artists, codified the perspective system developed by Brunelleschi and provided the first systematic account of the principles of good painting, the organization of pictorial space, the selection of figures, the expression of emotion through gesture and posture, that established a critical vocabulary for the assessment of painting that had no precedent in the medieval tradition, and that remained a point of reference for artistic theory. Across the following century, the Venetian painter Giovanni Bellini, who dominated painting in Venice across the second half of the 15th century and into the early decades of the 16th, was the teacher of both Giorgione and Titian, and consequently the founding figure of the Venetian colorist tradition that would prove one of the most significant and most far-reaching developments in the entire history of European painting, providing through its emphasis on the expressive possibilities of color and light a complement and an alternative to the Florentine emphasis on line and form that shaped the development of painting for the following 4 centuries. Bellini's specific contribution to the development of the Venetian tradition was his adoption and transformation of the oil painting technique that had been brought to Venice from Flanders by the painter Antonello da Messina in 1475 or 1476, and his exploitation of the specific possibilities of oil paint, its capacity for subtle tonal gradations, its transparency when used in glazes, its ability to record the specific quality of light on different surfaces, gave his late paintings a quality of luminous atmospheric depth that was entirely unprecedented in the Italian tradition, and that established the technical foundation on which Giorgione and Titian would build the mature achievements of the Venetian school. The painter Sandro Botticelli, who worked in Florence under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici, and whose most celebrated works, The Birth of Venus and the Primavera, remain among the most immediately recognizable images in the history of Western art, produced a body of work whose combination of linear grace, mythological subject matter, and Neoplatonic philosophical content reflected the specific intellectual and aesthetic culture of the Medici circle at the height of its cultural influence in the 1470s and 1480s. The Birth of Venus, painted in the early 1480s and now displayed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, depicts the goddess emerging from the sea on a shell in a composition whose specific imagery has been traced to ancient literary descriptions of a lost painting by the ancient Greek painter Apelles, and whose philosophical meaning has been interpreted in terms of the Neoplatonic philosophy of beauty and love that was the primary intellectual preoccupation of the Medici court during the period of its creation. The painting's combination of mythological subject matter, classical visual sources, and contemporary philosophical content made it one of the first large-scale mythological paintings in the history of Western art. The High Renaissance period, which most art historians locate in the years between approximately 1490 and 1520, and which produced the works most commonly associated with the Renaissance in popular consciousness, Leonardo's Last Supper, and Mona Lisa, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and David, Raphael's School of Athens, was concentrated primarily in the two cities of Florence and Rome, and represented the full maturity of the formal and intellectual investigations that the earlier Renaissance had initiated. The specific concentration of extraordinary artistic talent in this relatively brief period, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael were all working simultaneously in the first decade of the 16th century, frequently in the same cities and in close awareness of each other's work, has no real parallel in the history of any other art form in any other period, and has been the subject of sustained discussion by historians and philosophers of culture seeking to understand how such a concentration of genius could occur within a single generation in a single geographic area. The painter and polymath Leonardo da Vinci, whose career spans the transition between the early Renaissance and the High Renaissance, and who represents in his person the fullest realization of the Renaissance ideal of the universal man, produced in his relatively small body of completed paintings, fewer than 20 works are generally accepted as autograph, some of the most technically ambitious and most psychologically penetrating images in the history of AI. Western art, his development of the sfumato technique, the application of extremely thin glazes of paint to create soft, almost imperceptible transitions between tones and colors that give his figures a quality of atmospheric depth and psychological mystery that no earlier technique had achieved, represents his most distinctive and most consequential contribution to the technical vocabulary of painting, and the specific quality of luminous, smoky ambiguity that the technique produces is visible at its most completely realized in the Mona Lisa and the Virgin of the Rocks, the two paintings in which his mastery of the sfumato technique is most fully demonstrated. The painter Raphael Sanzio, who was born in Urbino in 1483 and who died in Rome at the age of 37 in 1520, produced in his brief career a body of work of such formal perfection, such compositional intelligence, and such immediate human warmth that he was celebrated by his contemporaries as the supreme painter of the age, and has remained one of the most universally admired figures in the entire history of Western art. His most celebrated work, the fresco of the School of Athens in the Stanza della Segnatura of the Vatican Palace, painted for Pope Julius II between 1509 and 1511, depicts the great philosophers of ancient Greece gathered in a grand architectural space whose specific setting draws on Bramante's design for the new St. Peter's Basilica, and whose combination of idealized beauty, compositional clarity, and humanist intellectual content represents the most completely realized expression of the high Renaissance synthesis of ancient wisdom and Christian civilization available in any surviving work of the period. The sculptor, painter, architect, and poet Michelangelo Buonarroti, who was born in 1475, and who lived to the extraordinary age of 88 in a century, when the average life expectancy was considerably lower, produced across his long career a body of work of such sustained ambition, such technical mastery, and such profound engagement with the human condition that his contemporaries described him as divine il divino, and subsequent centuries have consistently affirmed this judgment as no mere hyperbole. His marble sculpture of David, carved between 1501 and 1504 from a block of Carrara marble that had been abandoned as too difficult to work with by a previous sculptor, stands over 5 meters tall and represents the nude male figure at the peak of physical perfection in a pose that captures the psychological moment of concentrated resolve before action rather than the action itself, giving the sculpture a quality of interior dramatic tension that goes beyond the purely physical achievement of the figure to engage the viewer in the specific psychological experience of preparation for a decisive and irreversible act. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, which Michelangelo painted between 1508 and 1512 on commission from Pope Julius II, covers approximately 512 square meters and contains over 300 individual figures in the most ambitious single-painted program executed by any artist working alone in the entire history of Western art. The specific challenge of painting the ceiling working in fresco on a curved surface approximately 20 meters above the floor of the chapel, in a space that required the construction of elaborate scaffolding before any painting could begin, in a medium that demanded the completion of each day's work while the plaster was still wet, was compounded by the scale and the complexity of the iconographic program that Michelangelo developed for the ceiling, which encompassed the 9 scenes of the Book of Genesis along the central spine, the prophets and sibyls in the lunettes above the windows, and the ancestors of Christ in the curved surfaces of the spandrels and lunettes below, creating a theological program of extraordinary richness and interpretive depth. The Northern Renaissance, the extension of Renaissance ideas and Renaissance formal conventions across Northern Europe, including Germany, the Netherlands, France, England, and Spain, developed in ways that reflected both the specific influence of Italian Renaissance art through the movement of people, objects, and printed images across the Alps, and the specific character of the local artistic traditions and local cultural contexts within which the Italian influence was received and transformed. The specific character of Northern European painting in the 15th century, its extraordinary precision in the rendering of surface textures and material qualities, its interest in domestic interior settings, its use of symbolic objects embedded in apparently realistic scenes to carry theological and devotional meanings, gave the Northern Renaissance a character very different from the idealized beauty and the classical references that dominated the Italian tradition, and the synthesis of Northern and Italian elements that developed across the 16th century produced some of the most interesting and most formally inventive painting of the entire Renaissance period. The Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, who worked in the southern Netherlands in the 1420s and 1430s, and whose development of the oil painting technique established the foundation of the entire subsequent European tradition of oil painting, is one of the most consequential technical innovators in the history of Western art, even though his specific technical achievements have been the subject of considerable scholarly debate and revision across the centuries since his death. His most celebrated surviving work, the Arnolfini portrait, now displayed in the National Gallery in London, which depicts a wealthy Italian merchant and his wife in a Flemish interior in a double portrait of extraordinary technical refinement and symbolic complexity, demonstrates the specific qualities of the Flemish oil painting tradition at its most completely developed, with the material surfaces of the depicted objects, the chandelier, the mirror, the wooden floor, the fabrics of the costumes rendered with a precision and a tactile richness that the tempera technique of the Italian painters could not achieve, and that established a model for the representation of material reality in paint that Italian painters, most immediately Antonello da Messina, would subsequently seek to absorb and adapt. The German painter and printmaker Albrecht Dürer, who made 2 extended visits to Venice in 1494 and 1505, and who maintained throughout his career a sustained engagement with the Italian Renaissance through correspondence, the study of imported Italian prints and drawings, and the theoretical writings he produced on human proportion and the art of measurement, was the primary agent through which the formal achievements and the intellectual ambitions of the Italian Renaissance were absorbed into the German artistic tradition. His self-portrait of 1500, in which he depicted himself frontally in a pose that deliberately recalls conventional images of Christ, he was understood by his contemporaries, and has been understood by subsequent scholars, as a statement about the elevated status of the painter. The claim that the artist's God-given creative capacity was a reflection of divine creativity that gave the painter a dignity and a significance comparable to that of the most revered subjects of Christian devotional art. The painting remains one of the most philosophically charged and most formally audacious self-portraits in the history of Western art, and a work whose specific claim for the dignity of the artist was central to the broader Renaissance project of elevating the status of the visual arts from mechanical craft to liberal art. The printmaking revolution, initiated by Gutenberg's development of the printing press in the 1450s, and the subsequent development of techniques for the reproduction of images through woodcut and engraving that could be printed alongside text in the new printed books, transformed the conditions under which artistic ideas and artistic images could be disseminated across Europe, and played a crucial role in the spread of Renaissance formal conventions and Renaissance intellectual content from the Italian cities where they were developed to the broader European world. The specific role of prints in the dissemination of the Renaissance was particularly significant in the transfer of Italian Renaissance formal conventions to Northern Europe, where artists who could not afford to travel to Italy or who lacked the social connections to gain access to the major private collections of Italian art could nonetheless study the compositions, the figure types, and the decorative motifs of the Italian masters through the medium of prints that were relatively inexpensive, portable, and widely available in the specialized print shops that developed in the major commercial centers of Northern Europe across the second half of the 15th century. The fresco technique, the application of water-based pigments to freshly laid wet plaster so that the color bonds chemically with the wall surface as it dries and becomes permanently integrated with the architectural fabric. The building was the primary medium for monumental painting in Italy throughout the Renaissance period, and was responsible for the most ambitious and the most celebrated painted programs of the entire tradition. The specific demands of the fresco technique, the requirement to complete each day's work, the giornata, within the time available before the plaster dried and became unworkable, the impossibility of making significant corrections after the plaster had set, and the need to plan the entire composition in advance in sufficient detail to execute it section by section without losing the coherence of the whole, placed enormous demands on the organizational and executive abilities of the fresco painter, and gave the medium a specific character of decisive, confident execution that is visible in the finest examples of Renaissance fresco painting, and that distinguishes it fundamentally from the more hesitant and more correctable character of oil painting on canvas or panel. The technique of tempera painting, the mixing of dry pigment with egg yolk and water to produce a quick drying, opaque paint medium, that was the dominant technique for panel painting in Italy before the adoption of oil paint in the later 15th century, gave early Renaissance painting its characteristic quality of bright, clear color, precise linear definition, and relatively limited tonal range that distinguishes it visually from the richer, more atmospheric effects achievable in oil. The specific limitations of the tempera medium, its rapid drying time that prevented the blending of colors on the panel surface, its opacity that made glazing techniques difficult or impossible, and its tendency to crack if applied too thickly, shaped the formal conventions of early Renaissance painting in ways that went beyond the purely technical, influencing the specific approaches to color, line, and surface that characterized the tradition before the adoption of oil paint transformed its technical possibilities. The transition from tempera to oil that occurred in Italian painting between the 1470s and the 1520s was one of the most significant technical revolutions in the history of the medium, and one whose consequences, the formal possibilities of painting, were as far-reaching as any other single technical development in the tradition. The architect Filippo Brunelleschi's design and construction of the dome of the Florence Cathedral, the Cattedrale di Santa Maria del Fiore, between 1420 and 1436, represents the most spectacular single architectural achievement of the early Italian Renaissance and one of the most audacious feats of structural engineering in the history of architecture, involving the construction of the largest masonry dome ever built without the use of a supporting wooden centering that would have required more timber than was available in the entire region of Tuscany. The dome's specific structural solution, the double shell construction in which an inner and an outer dome are connected by a system of ribs and rings that distribute the outward thrust of the structure in a way that makes the centering unnecessary, was Brunelleschi's own invention, developed through a sustained investigation of the structural principles of ancient Roman dome construction, including the Pantheon in Rome, combined with the specific formal and engineering insights that the Florentine tradition of masonry construction had developed across the preceding centuries. The dome remains the largest masonry dome in the world, with an internal diameter of approximately 43 meters, and its red tiled exterior has defined the skyline of Florence for nearly 600 years. The painter Andrea Mantegna, who worked primarily at the court of the Gonzaga family in Mantua from 1460 until his death in 1506, was one of the most formally rigorous and the most intellectually ambitious painters of the Italian Renaissance, whose fascination with ancient Rome, its architecture, its sculpture, its inscriptions, its military equipment, gave his paintings a quality of archaeological specificity and learned classical reference that distinguished them sharply from the more generalized classicism of his Florentine contemporaries. His ceiling fresco in the Camera degli Sposi, the bridal chamber of the Gonzaga Palace in Mantua, painted between 1465 and 1474, is one of the most formally inventive and the most immediately impressive rooms in the entire history of Renaissance art, with the ceiling painted to appear as a circular opening to the sky through which figures and objects peer down at the viewer in a composition of extraordinary illusionistic ambition that represents the first fully realized example of the illusionistic ceiling, painting the di sotto in su perspective that would become one of the primary vehicles of Baroque decorative ambition in the following century. The Venetian painter Giorgione, who died of plague around 1510 at approximately the age of 32, produced in his brief career a body of work of such enigmatic beauty and such atmospheric depth that it transformed the direction of Venetian painting and established the mood of dreamy, meditative contemplation that would remain characteristic of the Venetian tradition at its most distinctive across the following century. Almost nothing is known with certainty about Giorgione's biography, and the attribution of specific works to his hand rather than to his contemporaries and followers has been one of the most persistently contested problems in Renaissance scholarship since the beginning of the systematic study of Italian art in the 18th century. The painting known as The Tempest, now displayed in the Gallery dell'Accademia in Venice, is generally accepted as one of the few works that can be attributed to him with reasonable confidence, and its combination of a mysterious, apparently narrative scene with a landscape of extraordinary atmospheric richness, the approaching storm, the lightning in the distance, the lush vegetation of the riverbank, gives a vivid picture of the specific quality of his achievement and the specific direction in which his brief career was pointing. The painter Titian, who was Giovanni Bellini's most gifted pupil, and who dominated Venetian painting for more than 60 years, from approximately 1510 until his death in 1576, at a very advanced age, possibly as old as 90 or more, was during the middle decades of the 16th century the most celebrated painter in Europe, attracting commissions from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, King Philip II of Spain, Pope Paul III, and virtually every major Italian prince and cardinal who could afford his prices. His development of a late painting style, characterized by an increasingly free and gestural application of paint, thick impasto in the lights, thin glazes in the shadows, and an overall looseness of brushwork that seems to anticipate the achievements of 19th century Impressionism by more than 3 centuries, represents one of the most radical, formal developments of the entire Renaissance period, and one whose implications for the development of Western painting were not fully understood until the 20th century, provided the critical framework needed to appreciate what he was doing in the final decades of his career. The sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, whose autobiography, written in the 1560s and published posthumously in 1728, is one of the most entertaining and most vividly personal documents of the Italian Renaissance, giving a vivid picture of the social world of the 16th century artist through the account of a man of extraordinary vanity, extraordinary skill, and extraordinary capacity for violence, who managed to maintain his position at the highest levels of European court patronage despite a series of scandals, imprisonments, and homicides that would have ended the careers of less gifted or less self-promoting artists. His gold and enamel salt cellar, made for King Francis I of France between 1540 and 1543, and now displayed in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, is the most completely preserved example of Renaissance goldsmith work by a known master, and one of the most technically accomplished and most formally inventive small-scale sculptures of the entire period. Combining figures of Neptune and Earth in a composition of extraordinary grace and formal ingenuity that gives the functional object of the salt cellar a quality of artistic ambition entirely disproportionate to its modest, practical purpose. The painter and architect Giorgio Vasari, whose Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, first published in 1550 and expanded in a second edition in 1568, is the primary source for our knowledge of the lives and the works of the Italian Renaissance artists from Cimabue to his own contemporaries, is himself one of the most important and the most influential figures in the history of Renaissance art. Not primarily as an artist, though his frescoes in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence are works of considerable quality, but as the inventor of the discipline of art history and the creator of the narrative framework within which the Renaissance has been understood ever since. Vasari's organizing concept, the idea of a rebirth of the arts in Italy after the dark centuries of medieval barbarism, progressing through the work of successive generations of artists toward the perfection achieved by Michelangelo, established the teleological narrative of artistic development that has shaped art historical thinking for nearly 5 centuries, and that remains one of the most consequential and the most contested frameworks in the history of the discipline. The Renaissance concept of the paragon, The competition between the arts for primacy as the supreme form of human creative achievement was one of the most productive and the most revealing intellectual debates of the Paragon period, generating arguments from the most distinguished artists and theorists of the age about the relative merits of painting, sculpture, and architecture as vehicles for the expression of the full range of human experience and the full capabilities of the human creative intelligence. Leonardo da Vinci's contribution to the Paragon debate, preserved in the notes gathered in the Codex Urbanus that were compiled from his manuscripts by his pupil Francesco Melzi, argued for the superiority of painting over sculpture on the grounds that painting required more intellectual effort to the creation of three-dimensional form through the purely optical means of color, light, and shadow, while sculpture simply removed material to reveal the form already present in the block of stone. Michelangelo's response that the finest painting was that which most closely approached the qualities of sculpture reflects the specific investment of a man who considered himself primarily a sculptor even when painting. The Sistine Chapel ceiling. The Palazzo Medici Riccardi in Florence, designed by Michelozzo di Bartolomeo for Cosimo de' Medici in the 1440s and completed in 1459, established the formal type of the Florentine Renaissance palace, the rusticated stone facade, the proportionally organized bays of windows, the overhanging cornice that would remain the primary model for Italian urban domestic architecture for the following century, and that influenced the development of palace architecture across Europe in the subsequent periods, architectural revival. The specific choice of Michelozzo's relatively restrained design over the more ambitious scheme proposed by Brunelleschi, which Cosimo rejected as too ostentatious for a family whose political position depended on the public maintenance of republican appearances, reflects the specific political calculations that shaped Renaissance patronage and gives the building a significance beyond its considerable architectural quality as an illustration of the specific constraints within which even the most powerful Renaissance patrons operated when the display of wealth and ambition had to be balanced against the social and political costs of appearing to exceed the bounds of appropriate civic modesty. The painter Luca Signorelli, who worked in central Italy in the final decades of the 15th century, and who received the commission to fresco the San Brizio Chapel in Orvieto Cathedral with scenes of the Last Judgment and the End of the World between 1499 and 1504. Produced in this commission the most extensive and the most formally ambitious representation of the nude human figure in violent action available in any surviving Italian painting before Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and his influence on the younger Michelangelo, who visited the chapel and studied its frescoes carefully, is one of the most clearly documented cases of artistic influence in the entire history of the Renaissance. Signorelli's extraordinary ability to render the male nude in extreme and complex poses of physical exertion, the damned falling toward hell, the demons torturing their victims, the blessed rising toward heaven with an anatomical accuracy and a compositional confidence that Michelangelo would develop and surpass in the Sistine ceiling, gave him a specific importance in the development of the High Renaissance approach to the heroic nude that the relative obscurity of his current reputation does not adequately reflect. The architectural treatise De Re Edificatoria on the Art of Building by Leon Battista Alberti, written in the 1440s and published posthumously in 1485, was the first comprehensive theoretical treatment of architecture produced in the Renaissance, and the work that established the systematic study of ancient Roman architecture as the foundation of the Renaissance architectural program, providing architects across Europe with a theoretical framework for understanding and applying the principles of classical architecture that Vitruvius's ancient treatise had described, but that Alberti's more systematic and more practically oriented account made considerably more accessible and more useful. Alberti's buildings, including the facade of the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini, and the churches of San Sebastiano and Sant' Andrea in Mantua, demonstrated in built form the principles he had described in his treatise and the specific way in which he adapted classical architectural elements, the arch, the column, the entablature to the requirements of Christian religious architecture, established models of classical ecclesiastical design that would be followed and elaborated by architects across Italy and subsequently across Europe for the following 2 centuries. The painter and writer Cennino Cennini, whose Handbook of Craft Practice, the Craftsman's Handbook, written around 1400, provides the most complete surviving account of the technical methods used by Italian painters of the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, gives an invaluable picture of the specific materials, the specific techniques, and the specific workshop practices that governed the production of Italian painting in the period immediately before the Renaissance transformations of technique and social status that would fundamentally alter the conditions of artistic production across the following century. The handbook's specific instructions for the preparation of panels, the grinding of pigments, the application of gold leaf, the mixing of tempera, and the organization of the painting process from the initial underdrawing to the final varnishing, give a practical and immediate picture of the workshop tradition within which Giotto's students and Masaccio's generation were, trained that no theoretical text or art historical account can fully replace, and the specific craft knowledge it preserves has been invaluable for conservators and technical art historians seeking to understand the material composition and the production history of specific early Renaissance works. The painter Piero di Cosimo, who worked in Florence in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and whose paintings are among the most formally inventive and the most personally idiosyncratic in the entire history of the Florentine Renaissance, represents an aspect of Renaissance artistic personality, the eccentric individual who departs significantly from the mainstream conventions of his period in pursuit of a personal vision that the dominant narrative of Renaissance art as a progressive movement toward an ideal of perfect beauty and formal perfection tends to obscure. His mythological paintings depicting scenes from the earliest periods of human history, when humanity lived in a state of primitive communion with the natural world before the development of civilization, show an artist who was genuinely interested in the formal and psychological possibilities of depicting figures in states of wild, uncontrolled behavior that the more decorous conventions of Florentine humanist painting did not encourage, and the specific quality of strangeness and imaginative freedom that distinguishes his work gives it a place in the broader picture of Renaissance art that simple canonical accounts of the period rarely accommodate. The Venetian painter Paolo Veronese, whose enormous decorative paintings, many of them depicting biblical and mythological subjects in the setting of magnificent Venetian architectural spaces populated by figures in contemporary Venetian costume, gave the interior, spaces of Venetian churches, palaces, and villas, a quality of luxurious visual splendor that was uniquely characteristic of the culture of the Serenissima at the height of its commercial and cultural prosperity in the second half of the 16th century. His painting of the feast in the house of Levi, originally titled The Last Supper, but retitled following his examination by the Venetian Inquisition in 1573, who objected to the inclusion of dogs, dwarfs, German soldiers, and other inappropriate figures in a scene of sacred significance, gives one of the most vivid and the most immediately informative pictures of the specific culture of Venetian Renaissance, painting its delight in physical luxury, its celebration of sensory pleasure, its confident integration of the sacred and the secular that any single work of the period can provide. The architect Andrea Palladio, who worked primarily in and around Vicenza in the Veneto region of northern Italy in the second half of the 16th century, and whose 4 books of architecture, published in 1570, were among the most widely read and the most frequently reprinted architectural texts of the following 3 centuries, exercised an influence on the subsequent development of Western architecture, particularly in England, Ireland, and the eastern seaboard of North America, that makes him arguably the most influential architect of the entire Renaissance tradition in terms of the practical impact of his work on the built environments that the majority of Western people inhabit. The specific qualities of Palladio's architecture, its clarity of plan, its systematic application of classical proportional relationships to the design of rural and urban buildings, its adaptation of the temple front to the design of private residences, gave his buildings and his published designs a quality of formal intelligibility and practical applicability that made them the natural model for architects. Working in new cultural contexts, seeking to establish their credentials through reference to the authority of the ancient and the Italian traditions simultaneously. The painter El Greco, born Dominikos Theotokopoulos in Crete in 1541, trained in the Byzantine icon painting tradition before moving to Venice to study with Titian, and subsequently settling in Toledo in Spain, where he spent the remainder of his career, represents one of the most complex and most formally distinctive artistic personalities of the late 16th century, producing in his Toledo period a body of work whose combination of Byzantine spiritual intensity, Venetian colorism, and Mannerist formal distortion gave it a character unlike anything produced by any of his contemporaries. His most celebrated work, The Burial of the Count of Orgaz, painted for the Church of Santo Tome in Toledo in 1586, and still displayed in the church for which it was made, divides its composition between an earthly zone in the lower half, showing the burial scene, depicted with a quality of portrait realism that gives the assembled Toledan nobles recognizable individual faces, and a celestial zone in the upper half, showing the heavenly reception of the Count's soul in a composition of ecstatic spiritual intensity that seems to abandon the spatial logic of the earthly scene in favor of the Byzantine tradition of spiritual representation from which its creator had come. The development of oil painting as the dominant technique for Italian Renaissance art, which occurred gradually across the final decades of the 15th century and the first decades of the 16th, transformed not only the technical possibilities available to Italian painters, but also the social and commercial conditions under which paintings were produced and exchanged, since the ability to paint on portable canvas rather than on fixed plaster walls or wooden panels permanently attached to specific architectural settings gave paintings a mobility and a market value that the fresco tradition could not provide. The specific advantages of oil on canvas over the earlier traditions of fresco and tempera panel painting, the ability to make corrections and revisions at any stage of the work, the capacity for subtle tonal gradations through the layering of transparent glazes, the flexibility of the support material that allowed large works to be rolled for transport, and the durability of the finished surface that allowed paintings to survive conditions of storage and transport that would have destroyed fresco, and that caused significant deterioration in wooden panel paintings, gave the new technique a practical utility that contributed as much to its rapid adoption as its purely aesthetic advantages. The painter Hans Holbein the Younger, who worked in England from 1532 until his death in 1543 as court painter to King Henry VIII, produced a body of portrait painting that represents the application of the most rigorous formal discipline and the most precise technical control of the Northern European painting tradition to the specific demands of royal, aristocratic portraiture in a court environment of intense political sensitivity and personal danger. His double portrait of the French ambassadors, Jean de Dinteville and Georges de Selve, known as the Ambassadors, and now displayed in the National Gallery in London, is the most formally complex and the most iconographically rich of all his surviving works, combining a portrait of two men of the highest social distinction with an elaborate still life of objects on two shelves between them that document their specific interests and their specific social roles, and with the famous anamorphic skull stretched across the foreground of the composition, visible as a skull only when seen from a specific oblique angle that introduces a meditation on mortality and transience into a scene of worldly power and cultural accomplishment. The painter Peter Bruegel the Elder, who worked in the Netherlands in the 1550s and 1560s, and whose paintings of Flemish peasant life, of the months and seasons, and of biblical and mythological subjects set in contemporary Northern European landscapes, represent the fullest and the most formally accomplished expression of the Northern European Renaissance tradition at the point of its greatest divergence from the Italian models that had shaped its earlier development, produced a body of work whose specific formal qualities and specific thematic concerns have continued to generate new scholarly and critical attention across the 5 centuries since his death. His painting, The Hunters in the Snow, one of a series of 6 paintings depicting the months of the year, of which 5 survive and are now among the most celebrated works in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, gives one of the most immediately beautiful and the most formally accomplished representations of winter landscape in the entire history of Western painting, combining a panoramic view of a snow-covered Flemish village with a foreground group of weary hunters returning from a fruitless expedition in a composition of extraordinary spatial depth and atmospheric subtlety that demonstrates the full achievement of the Northern European landscape tradition at its most completely developed. The Mannerist style that developed in Italy in the 1520s and that dominated Italian painting and sculpture for the following 5 or 6 decades before the emergence of the Baroque style at the end of the 16th century, represents a deliberate and self-conscious engagement with the formal achievements of the High Renaissance that goes beyond imitation to a sophisticated exploration of the expressive possibilities of the exaggeration, the complication, and the deliberate disruption of the formal harmony and the naturalistic clarity that the High Renaissance had achieved. The specific formal characteristics of Mannerist art, the elongated, serpentine figures, the complex and sometimes deliberately obscure spatial arrangements, the intense and sometimes acidic colors, the deliberately ambiguous relationship between the depicted figures and the space they inhabit reflect a specific artistic intelligence that found in the very perfection of the High Renaissance achievement a challenge to the continued vitality of artistic production that could only be met through the deliberate complication and the deliberate questioning of the values that achievement had established. The painter Pontormo, whose real name was Jacopo Carucci, and who took his name from the small Tuscan village where he was born in 1494, was one of the most formally inventive and the most psychologically intense painters of the Florentine Mannerist movement, producing a body of work whose combination of brilliant, unexpected color, complex figure arrangements in shallow, ambiguous spaces, and quality of anxious spiritual intensity gave it a character entirely distinctive from the classically harmonious ideals of the High Renaissance that had immediately preceded it. His altarpiece of the Deposition from the Cross, painted for the Capponi Chapel in the church of Santa Felicita in Florence, between 1525 and 1528, is generally considered the supreme masterpiece of Florentine mannerism and one of the most formally audacious paintings of the entire 16th century. Its figures arranged in a complex interlocking composition of pure color, pinks, greens, blues, and oranges of extraordinary freshness and luminosity without any conventional spatial setting to anchor them in a recognizable physical reality, creating an image of intense spiritual disturbance whose formal means are as far from the classical ideals of Raphael as anything produced in the Italian tradition of the period. The patronage of Pope Julius II, who occupied the papacy from 1503 to 1513, was the single most consequential act of institutional art patronage in the history of the Italian Renaissance, generating, in the brief decade of his pontificate, the commission for Raphael's Vatican frescoes, the commission for Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, the beginning of the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica under the architect Bramante, and the assembly of the most important collection of ancient sculpture, including the Laocoön, discovered in a Roman vineyard in 1506 in the modern world. Julius's specific approach to patronage, his willingness to commission work of unprecedented ambition from the most gifted artists available, his personal engagement with the projects he commissioned, and his combination of genuine aesthetic vision with the political intelligence to understand how the resources of the papacy could be deployed in the service of a cultural program that would simultaneously glorify God, the Church, and the pontificate of Julius himself, made his decade in power the most creatively fertile period in the history of papal patronage, and the moment at which Rome definitively replaced Florence as the primary center of Italian artistic activity. The concept of disegno drawing or design was the foundational concept of Florentine and Central Italian Renaissance art theory, and the term around which the most significant aesthetic debates of the period were organized, encompassing not simply the physical activity of making marks on paper, but the entire intellectual process by which the artist conceived and planned a composition, from the initial idea in the mind, through its progressive realization in preparatory sketches and finished drawings, to its final execution in the chosen medium. The specific importance of disegno in the Florentine tradition reflected the specific hierarchy of values that gave priority to intellectual conception over sensory effect in the assessment of artistic achievement, and the sustained theoretical debate about the relative importance of disegno and color. The Florentine emphasis on line and intellectual conception versus the Venetian emphasis on color and sensory pleasure was one of the most productive and the most revealing intellectual controversies in the history of Renaissance art theory, generating arguments that illuminated fundamental differences in the understanding of what art was and what it was for, that went considerably beyond the specific technical question of the relative merits of line and color as pictorial means. The painter Andrea del Sarto, who worked in Florence in the 1510s and 1520s, and who was described by Vasari as the faultless painter because of the extraordinary technical perfection of his work, represents a specific strand of Florentine Renaissance painting, technically accomplished, formally balanced, emotionally measured, that the dramatic, formal experiments of his Mannerist contemporaries and pupils have tended to overshadow in the subsequent critical history of the period, but that was recognized by his contemporaries as representing the highest standard of painterly execution available in the Florentine tradition. His fresco cycle in the atrium of the church of the Santissima Annunziata in Florence, painted across several campaigns between 1510 and 1526, gave the young Pontormo and Rosso Fiorentino, who painted their own contributions to the same cycle, an immediate and demanding standard against which to measure their own emerging formal ambitions, and the specific interaction between Del Sarto's mature classical manner and the deliberately unconventional approaches of his pupils gives the Santissima Annunziata atrium a unique quality as a document of the moment at which the High Renaissance and the Mannerist departure from it coexisted in direct physical proximity. The architect, Donato Bramante, who began his career in the service of Ludovico Sforza in Milan, where he worked alongside Leonardo da Vinci, and who subsequently moved to Rome following the French invasion of Milan in 1499, was the primary architect of the High Renaissance in Rome and the man whose specific vision for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, a centrally planned building crowned by a dome derived from the ancient Pantheon, established the terms within which Michelangelo, Sangallo, and ultimately Giacomo della Porta would realize the building that has defined the skyline of Rome for 4 centuries. His small circular temple, known as the Tempietto, the little temple built in the courtyard of the Church of San Pietro in Montorio in Rome in 1502, on the spot traditionally identified as the site of St. Peter's martyrdom, is generally considered the most completely perfect single architectural work of the High Renaissance. Its combination of ancient Roman structural elements, the Doric order, the classical entablature, the cylindrical drum and hemispherical dome, in a composition of such formal clarity and such proportional perfection that it became immediately and permanently the primary reference point for centrally planned religious architecture. In the Western tradition, the Venetian architect Jacopo Sansovino, who fled to Venice following the sack of Rome in 1527 and who subsequently became the city's official architect, transformed the visual character of the area around the Piazza Marco through a series of buildings, the Biblioteca Marciana, the Zecca or Mint, the Loggia at the base of the Campanile, that introduced the vocabulary of the Roman High Renaissance to the Venetian urban fabric in ways that gave the primary civic space of the city a quality of classical grandeur without entirely displacing the Gothic and Byzantine character of the existing built environment. The Biblioteca Marciana, begun in 1537 to house the collection of Greek manuscripts bequeathed to the Venetian Republic by the Byzantine Cardinal Bessarion, is generally considered Sansovino's finest building and one of the supreme architectural achievements of the 16th century. Its 2-story facade of superimposed Doric and Ionic orders enriched with sculptural decoration of extraordinary quality, some of it produced by Sansovino himself and some by the other sculptors working under his direction, giving the building a quality of festive, classical richness entirely appropriate to the cultural ambitions of the institution it was designed to house. The painter Correggio, who worked primarily in the northern Italian city of Parma in the 1520s and 1530s, in relative isolation from the main centers of Renaissance artistic activity, but who developed in this provincial setting a style of extraordinary formal and coloristic sophistication that anticipated several of the primary formal strategies of the Baroque by nearly a century, is one of the most formally innovative and the most underestimated figures in the entire history of the Italian Renaissance. His frescoes in the dome of the Cathedral of Parma, painted between 1526 and 1530, depicting the Assumption of the Virgin in a swirling upward composition of foreshortened figures that seems to dissolve the solid surface of the dome into an opening toward the sky through which the ascending figure of the Virgin passes. Upward toward the golden light of heaven, represent the most ambitious, illusionistic ceiling painting of the entire Renaissance period, and the work whose specific formal solutions, the radical foreshortening of figures seen from below, the dissolution of the architectural boundary between the interior space and the painted heaven above, would provide the primary model for the ceiling decorators of the 17th century Baroque. The High Renaissance sculptor Jacopo Sansovino, the same man who would later become Venice's primary architect, produced in his Roman years, before the sack of 1527, a series of marble sculptures that represent the fullest and most accomplished expression of the classical ideal in Italian sculpture after Michelangelo, and whose combination of physical beauty, compositional elegance, and technical refinement gave him a reputation among his contemporaries as the greatest sculptor of his generation after Michelangelo himself. His marble statue of Bacchus, now in the Bargello Museum in Florence, was produced in direct response to Michelangelo's own marble Bacchus in the same museum, and the comparison between the two works produced within approximately 20 years of each other by the two most gifted marble sculptors of their generation gives one of the most instructive illustrations of the specific differences in formal sensibility and artistic personality that distinguish the high Renaissance tradition of idealized classical beauty from the more psychologically complex and formally disturbing approach that Michelangelo had. Introduced into the tradition, the spread of the Renaissance to France occurred primarily through the direct importation of Italian artists by the French royal court, most famously when King Francis I invited Leonardo da Vinci to spend his final years in France and subsequently assembled at the Palace of Fontainebleau a group of Italian artists, including the painter Rosso Fiorentino and the sculptor Primaticcio, whose work established the school of Fontainebleau as the primary vehicle through which Renaissance formal conventions and Renaissance intellectual content were disseminated into the French artistic tradition. The specific character of the school of Fontainebleau, its sophisticated mannerist figure style, its elaborate decorative programs combining painting and stucco, work in the distinctive format of framed scenes surrounded by painted and modeled ornament that became one of the primary decorative inventions of the 16th century, gave French Renaissance art a specific formal character that was neither straightforwardly Italian nor purely French, but a genuinely hybrid creation reflecting the specific conditions of cultural transfer in which it was produced. The painter Rosso Fiorentino, who left Florence for Rome following the sack of 1527 and subsequently travelled to France, where he became one of the primary artists of the school of Fontainebleau, represents one of the most formally extreme and the most emotionally disturbing figures in the entire Mannerist movement, producing in his Italian years a series of paintings whose combination of harsh, dissonant colours, violently distorted figures, and apparently arbitrary spatial arrangements gave them a quality of anguished, formal dislocation that makes them among the most unsettling works produced in the Italian Renaissance tradition. His altarpiece of the Deposition from the Cross, painted for the town of Volterra in 1521 and now displayed in the Pinacoteca Comunale of that town, presents the figures of the Deposition with a rigidity and an angularity of form and an intensity of colour, the harsh pinks, the cold greys, the sickly yellows that seem to deny the possibility of the consolation and the redemption that the subject matter conventionally promised, creating an image of grief and loss of such unmediated emotional directness that it has been described by scholars as one of the most powerful expressions of religious feeling in the entire history of Italian painting. The printmaker and engraver Marcantonio Raimondi, who worked in Rome in the early 16th century and who produced engravings after designs by Raphael that were distributed across Europe through the print trade, played a crucial role in the dissemination of the high Renaissance formal ideal beyond the limited audience that could have direct experience of the original works, making the compositions and the figure types of the most celebrated paintings of the period available to artists and collectors across the entire European world in a form that was relatively inexpensive and relatively portable. The collaboration between Raphael and Raimondi, in which Raphael provided drawings specifically designed for reproduction as prints, and Raimondi translated them into the linear language of engraving with extraordinary skill, Fidelity established a model of the relationship between the creative artist and the reproductive printmaker that would remain a primary mechanism for the dissemination of artistic ideas across Europe until the development of photographic reproduction in the 19th century fundamentally transformed the conditions under which visual images could be reproduced and distributed. The painter Jacopo Tintoretto, who worked in Venice from the 1530s until his death in 1594, and who described his own ambition as to combine the drawing of Michelangelo with the colour of Titian, produced in his enormous output, he was among the most prolific painters of the entire Renaissance period. A series of large-scale canvases for the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice that represent the most ambitious decorative painting program of the later Venetian Renaissance, and one of the most completely realized expressions of the dramatic, dynamic figure style of late Mannerist painting. The paintings that cover the walls and ceilings of the 3 rooms of the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, executed across a period of more than 20 years, between 1564 and 1587, constitute the most extensive single body of work by any artist preserved in its original setting in the entire history of the Italian Renaissance, and the experience of moving through the 3 rooms of the building, surrounded on all sides by Tintoretto's characteristic combination of extreme figure foreshortening, dramatic lighting effects, and compositional complexity, is one of the most distinctive and the most overwhelming available in any Renaissance building anywhere in the world. The Renaissance ideal of the universal manuomo, universale, whose capabilities were understood to encompass the full range of human intellectual and creative achievement, rather than being confined to a single specialized field, was given its most complete and its most influential theoretical expression in Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, published in 1528, which described the ideal qualities of the perfect Renaissance gentleman in terms that combined physical accomplishment, military skill, courtly grace, musical ability, intellectual cultivation, and the ability to engage with the full range of arts and learning that Renaissance civilization had assembled from its classical and contemporary sources. The specific influence of the courtier on the subsequent development of Renaissance culture across Europe was enormous. The book was translated into virtually every major European language within decades of its publication, and was really read and discussed by the most educated and the most socially ambitious members of every European society that aspired to participation in the culture of the Italian Renaissance, and the specific image of the cultivated, multi-talented gentleman that it described became one of the primary models for the self-understanding of the European educated elite for more than a century after its publication. The Spanish painter Diego Velázquez, who served as court painter to King Philip IV of Spain from 1623 until his death in 1660, and who visited Italy twice in his career to study the masterworks of the Renaissance tradition at first hand, produced a body of work that represents the fullest and the most formally accomplished expression of the late Renaissance tradition of court portraiture in any European national school, combining the tonal subtlety and the atmospheric depth of the Venetian colorist tradition with a quality of psychological penetration and social observation that is entirely his own. His painting, Las Meninas, the Ladies in Waiting, painted in 1656, and now displayed in the Prado Museum in Madrid, is generally considered the most formally complex and the most philosophically suggestive painting of the entire Spanish Golden Age. Its depiction of the royal family of Philip IV, in the context of the artist's own studio, raising questions about the nature of representation, the relationship between the depicted and the real, and the social position of the artist at court, that have made it one of the most extensively analysed works in the entire history of Western painting. The Italian sculptor Giovanni da Bologna, known in the Spanish-speaking world as Giambologna, who was born in Flanders in 1529, and who settled in Florence, where he became the primary sculptor at the Medici court in the second half of the 16th century, represents the bridge between the Mannerist sculpture of the mid-16th century and the Baroque sculpture that would emerge in Rome at the beginning of the 17th, producing in his mature works a series of marble and bronze figures whose combination of extreme formal complexity, virtuosic technical accomplishment, and multi-viewpoint composition gave them a specifically transitional character that makes them essential for understanding the development of the sculptural tradition across this crucial period. His marble group of the Rape of the Sabine Women, completed in 1583 and installed in the Loggia dei Lanzi in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence, where it remains today, was the first large-scale sculptural group designed to be seen from all sides, simultaneously rather than from a single privileged viewpoint, and the specific spiral composition of the three interlocking figures, the old man, the young man, and the woman that it employs, became one of the primary formal contributions of the Mannerist sculptural tradition to the subsequent development of Baroque multi-figure composition. The concept of sprezzatura, the art of making difficult things appear effortless, to of performing with such practiced ease that the labor and the skill required for the performance are entirely concealed, was defined by Castiglione in the Book of the Courtier as the fundamental quality of the perfect Renaissance. Gentlemen, and has been applied by art historians to describe the specific quality of controlled ease and apparent spontaneity that characterizes the finest works of the High Renaissance style. The specific quality of sprezzatura in Renaissance art, the way in which the most technically demanding passages of a painting or sculpture appear to have been executed with casual, unconsidered ease, rather than with the enormous effort and the sustained technical mastery that their actual production required, is one of the primary markers of artistic achievement in the High Renaissance tradition. And the contrast between the apparent effortlessness of the finest Renaissance works and the evident struggle and labor of less accomplished productions gives the concept a practical, critical utility that goes beyond its purely theoretical. Interest as a definition of ideal social behavior. The painter Sofonisba Anguissola, who was born in Cremona around 1532 and who was trained by the local painter Bernardino Campi before receiving instruction from Michelangelo himself, who examined her drawings and expressed his admiration for her. Abilities became, in the 1560s, one of the most celebrated portrait painters in Europe and the first Italian woman artist to achieve an international reputation and a permanent place in the canonical history of Renaissance art. She served as a lady-in-waiting and court painter to Queen Isabella of Valois at the Spanish court of Philip II from 1560 until 1573, producing portraits of the Spanish royal family of considerable quality and formal accomplishment, and she continued to paint until an advanced old age. She is said to have been still receiving visitors who came to study her work when she was in her 90s, giving her a career of extraordinary longevity and extraordinary range that has been progressively better appreciated as the study of women artists in the Renaissance has become one of the most active areas of scholarship in the discipline. The architect, Michelangelo's design for the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which he undertook after his appointment as chief architect of the building in 1546 at the age of 71, and which was completed after his death in 1564 by Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana between 1588 and 1590, is the most celebrated single architectural element of the Renaissance and the work that has defined the skyline of Rome more completely than any other structure built in any period of the city's long history. The specific formal qualities of the dome, its double shell construction, its ribbed exterior profile derived from Brunelleschi's Florence dome, while modified toward a more elongated silhouette that gives it a greater vertical emphasis. Its drum of paired columns and large windows that give the transition between the drum and the dome a quality of architectural richness and formal clarity, simultaneously established a model for the domed church building that was reproduced, adapted, and developed by architects across Europe and the Americas for the following 3 centuries, giving the Renaissance architectural tradition one of its most consequential and most widely distributed formal inventions. The German painter Lucas Cranach the Elder, who worked primarily in the Saxon court of the Electors of Saxony from 1505 until his death in 1553, and who was a close friend and prominent supporter of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, represents the specific intersection of Renaissance artistic production with the religious revolution of the 16th century that transformed the conditions of artistic patronage and artistic subject matter across Northern Europe in ways that had no precise equivalent in the Catholic South. Cranach's paintings for the Protestant caused the portraits of Luther and other Reformation leaders, the allegorical compositions contrasting the grace of the Gospel with the law of the Old Testament, and the specifically Protestant devotional images that replaced the Catholic saints and the Marian subjects of the medieval tradition with subjects more consistent with the Protestant theology of grace and Scripture, gave visual form to the new religious culture of the Reformation in a way that made him one of the most important artists of the 16th century, not primarily in terms of formal innovation, but in terms of the specific cultural and political impact of his work on the society in which he lived and worked. The painter Lavinia Fontana, who was born in Bologna in 1552, and who trained with her father, Prospero Fontana, before establishing an independent career that made her one of the most commercially successful portrait painters in late 16th century. Italy represents a further stage in the progressive entry of women artists into the professional structures of Renaissance artistic production that Sofonisba Anguissola had pioneered in the preceding generation. She was the first woman in the history of Western art to receive a public commission for an altarpiece, the painting of the Holy Family with the sleeping Christ child for the Church of San Giovanni in Monte in Bologna, commissioned in 1584, and the first to achieve a substantial career producing works for public, religious, and civic institutions, alongside the private portrait commissions that were the primary source of income for most professional painters of the period. She moved to Rome in 1603 under papal patronage and continued to work there until her death in 1614, leaving a body of work of considerable range and considerable quality that has been the subject of increasing scholarly attention since the 1980s. The Renaissance garden, the formal landscape design that developed in Italy from the late 15th century onward and that applied the same principles of geometric order, classical reference, and humanist symbolism to the outdoor space surrounding a villa or palace that the architects and painters of the period applied to the buildings and the interior spaces they were designing, represents one of the most significant and the most completely realized expressions of Renaissance ideas about the relationship between nature and human reason, between the wild and the cultivated, and between the ancient past and the contemporary present. The Villa d'Este at Tivoli near Rome, whose gardens were laid out beginning in 1550 under the direction of the Cardinal Ippolito II d'Este to designs by the architect Piero Ligorio, is generally considered the most completely realized and the most formally magnificent surviving example of the Italian Renaissance garden. Its multiple terraced levels connected by staircases and ramps, its extraordinary collection of fountains fed by diverted water from the nearby river, and its elaborate program of ancient and mythological sculptural references, giving it a quality of total designed environment that makes it one of the most ambitious, single artistic undertakings of the entire 16th century. The painter Francesco Primaticcio, who arrived at the French court of Francis I in 1532 as a collaborator of Rosso Fiorentino, and who subsequently became the dominant artistic personality at Fontainebleau following Rosso's death in 1540, developed in his decorative programs for the various galleries and apartments of the palace a specific combination of elongated Mannerist figures in stucco surrounding painted scenes in framed compartments that established the vocabulary of the school of Fontainebleau and provided the primary formal model for the decorative arts and the interior design of the French Renaissance across the following half-century. Primaticcio's specific achievement at Fontainebleau, which extended across more than 4 decades of continuous work from his arrival in 1532 until his death in 1570, was to create an environment of extraordinary decorative richness that translated the formal achievements of Italian mannerism into a specifically French idiom, giving the French royal court an artistic culture that could claim both its Italian credentials and its specifically French character, in a synthesis that became the foundation of the French decorative tradition for the following century. The development of the Renaissance portrait as a primary art form, the production of images of specific named individuals as an expression of their specific identity, their specific social position, and their specific personal qualities was one of the most significant cultural achievements of the period, and one that reflected the specific humanist conviction that the individual human being was a subject of the highest artistic and intellectual significance, rather than simply a vehicle for the illustration of universal Christian or classical truths. The transformation of the portrait from the profile format of the early 15th century derived from the ancient coin portrait and giving the sitter the quality of a timeless heraldic image to the three-quarter view. That became standard from the 1480s onward, allowing the depiction of both eyes and, consequently, a much richer representation of individual psychological character was one of the most consequential formal developments in the history of Renaissance art, and the specific role of Flemish portrait painters in establishing the three-quarter view as the primary convention of European portraiture was acknowledged by Italian artists and theorists as one of the primary contributions of the strange northern tradition to the broader development of Renaissance painting. The Mannerist painter Agnolo Bronzino, who served as court painter to Cosimo I de' Medici in Florence from the 1530s until his death in 1572, produced, in his official portraits of the Medici family and their court, a style of extraordinary formal refinement and psychological opacity that gives the subjects of his most celebrated works a quality of beautiful, impenetrable reserve, a glazed and luminous perfection of surface that simultaneously reveals and conceals the specific individuals behind the perfect painted mask of their official appearance. His portrait of Eleanor of Toledo with her son Giovanni, painted around 1545 and now displayed in the Uffizi Gallery, is generally considered the supreme achievement of his career and one of the most formally accomplished portraits of the entire 16th century. Its combination of the extraordinary precision of the rendering of Eleanor's elaborately brocaded silk dress, whose specific pattern of pomegranates is rendered with a degree of textile accuracy that has allowed the identification of specific surviving examples of the type of fabric with the cold, composed beauty of the sitter's face, creating an image of courtly magnificence and personal remoteness that perfectly embodies the specific political culture of Medici absolutism. The English Renaissance, the extension of the Renaissance formal vocabulary and the Renaissance intellectual culture into the English artistic tradition that occurred primarily in the second half of the 16th century during the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I were shaped by the specific religious, political, and cultural conditions of England in ways that gave it a character considerably different from the Italian Renaissance that nominally inspired it, and considerably different from the more directly Italian-influenced Renaissances, France, the Netherlands, and Spain. The primary vehicle through which Renaissance ideas and Renaissance forms reached England was not the direct importation of Italian artists, though Henry VIII did bring Italian craftsmen to work on his palaces, most notably the sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, who carved the royal tombs at Westminster, but the printed book and the engraved image, through which the intellectual content and the formal conventions of the Continental Renaissance were made available to English scholars, architects, and craftsmen who had neither the resources nor the inclination to travel to Italy to study the originals at first hand. The painter Nicholas Hilliard, who worked primarily as a miniaturist at the court of Elizabeth I of England from the 1570s until his death in 1619, developed in the small-scale format of the portrait miniature a specifically English Renaissance art form that combined the formal precision of the Flemish portrait tradition with the decorative sophistication of the courtly culture of the Elizabethan age, to produce works of extraordinary delicacy and refinement that give the most vivid and the most humanly immediate picture of the individual personalities of the Elizabethan court, available in any surviving medium. His miniature portraits of Elizabeth herself, in the many versions produced across the decades of his service to the Queen and of the courtiers and intellectuals who surrounded her, give a picture of the Elizabethan world, extraordinary intimacy and psychological specificity, and the specific combination of their precise technical execution, their rich symbolic detail, and their quality of concentrated personal observation makes them among the most distinctive and the most accomplished products of the English Renaissance. The impact of the sack of Rome in 1527, when the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V overran and looted the city for several months, killing thousands of its inhabitants, pillaging its churches and palaces, and temporarily destroying the culture of papal patronage that had made it the primary center of Italian artistic activity for the previous 3 decades, on the subsequent development of Renaissance art was enormous and is visible in the dispersal of the Roman artistic community that it caused, sending artists who had been working in Rome to cities across Italy and beyond, where they carried the formal achievements and the formal vocabulary of the High Renaissance and the emerging Mannerist style. The specific artists dispersed by the Sac Rosso Fiorentino to France, Giulio Romano to Mantua, Sebastiano del Piombo across Italy, and many others to Venice, Naples, and the courts of smaller Italian princes gave the formal achievements of the Roman High Renaissance a geographical distribution that the patronage networks of the pre-Sac period could never have produced, making the catastrophic political event of 1527 one of the primary mechanisms through which the artistic culture of the Renaissance was disseminated beyond Rome to the broader European world. The painter Giulio Romano, who was Raphael's most gifted pupil and who took over the management of Raphael's workshop following his master's death in 1520, was invited to Mantua in 1524 by Federico Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua, and spent the remaining decades of his career there, transforming the physical and artistic environment of the Gonzaga capital in ways that gave the small northern Italian duchy a cultural profile out of all proportion to its modest political and military significance. His most celebrated single achievement at Mantua, the Palazzo del Te, built and decorated on the southern edge of the city between 1526 and 1534 as a pleasure palace, for the Duke represents one of the most formally inventive and the most architecturally sophisticated buildings of the entire 16th century, its facade and courtyard deliberately subverting the classical architectural rules that Bramante and Raphael had codified in their Roman buildings through a series of knowing formal jokes, the deliberately slipped triglyphs, the deliberately rough keystones that can only be understood and appreciated by a viewer who knows the rules well enough to recognize and enjoy their systematic violation. The German Renaissance artist Matthias Grunewald, whose real name was Mathis Gotthard Neithardt, and who worked in the early 16th century in the German-speaking world, approximately contemporary with Dürer, represents the most extreme example of the divergence between the northern and the southern Renaissance traditions, in their respective approaches to the representation of the sacred, producing in his Eisenheim altarpiece a representation of the crucified Christ of such physical and psychological extremity, the distorted, lacerated body, the tortured face, the raw wounds, that it stands as the most powerful statement of the limits of the Italian Renaissance ideal of beauty as the appropriate vehicle for the expression of Christian devotion. The Eisenheim altarpiece, painted for the monastery of St. Anthony in Eisenheim and now displayed in the Unterlinden Museum in Colmar, France, was made for a hospital that treated patients suffering from skin diseases, and the specific representation of Christ's suffering body, its skin covered in lesions consistent with the diseases treated at the hospital, was intended to give the patients who looked at it the consolation of seeing their own physical suffering reflected in the body of the Saviour. The work's combination of this specific devotional function with its extraordinary formal power gives it a significance in the history of Christian art that goes far beyond its place in the chronology of the German Renaissance. The development of the Renaissance in Spain, which occurred primarily in the 16th century under the patronage of the Spanish royal court and the great nobility, produced a distinctive artistic tradition that combined the formal vocabulary of the Italian Renaissance with the specific spiritual intensity of Spanish Catholicism and the decorative richness of the late Gothic Plateresque style. The elaborately ornamented style of architectural decoration that takes its name from the silversmith's work, whose intricate surface patterning it resembles. The specific character of the Spanish Renaissance was shaped by the patronage of the Habsburgs Charles V and Philip II, whose political connection to the Italian peninsula through their control of Naples, Sicily, and the Duchy of Milan gave them direct access to the most accomplished Italian artists and the most advanced Italian artistic culture, while their simultaneous role as the primary defenders of Catholic orthodoxy against the Protestant Reformation gave the art they commissioned a specific quality of counter-Reformation spiritual intensity that distinguished it clearly from the more secularly humanist character of much Italian Renaissance production. The painter Paolo Veronese's examination by the Venetian Inquisition in 1573, prompted by the inclusion in his large painting of the Last Supper of dogs, dwarfs, German soldiers, and a jester, elements that the inquisitors considered inappropriate for a scene of sacred significance, gives one of the most illuminating single documents in the history of Renaissance art for the understanding of the specific tensions between artistic freedom and religious authority that shaped the conditions of artistic production in the later 16th century. Veronese's response to the inquisitors' questions, his defense of the painter's right to include decorative figures in large compositions on the grounds that poets and madmen take license in their works, and he had taken similar license, reflects both the specific understanding of artistic freedom that the Renaissance had developed, and the specific limits of that understanding in the context of the Counter-Reformation churches, increasing concern with the appropriate representation of sacred subject. The Inquisition's relatively mild resolution of the dispute, requiring Veronese simply to change the title of the painting rather than to alter its content, suggests that the tension between artistic and religious authority in Venice was managed with more flexibility than in other parts of Catholic Europe. The legacy of the Italian Renaissance for the subsequent development of Western art is so fundamental and so pervasive that it is, in many respects, more accurate to describe it as the foundation on which the subsequent tradition was built, than as one period among others in a sequence of equally significant cultural moments. The specific formal achievements of the Renaissance, the development of linear perspective, the systematic investigation of human anatomy, the establishment of the classical orders as the primary vocabulary of Western architecture, the elevation of painting and sculpture to the status of liberal arts, the creation of the concept of the individual artistic genius were each of such fundamental importance to the subsequent development of Western visual culture that their influence cannot be isolated from the tradition they helped to shape, but must be understood as constitutive of it, as the deep structure within which all subsequent Western artistic development has taken place, regardless of whether specific later artists were consciously aware of or explicitly engaged with their Renaissance sources. The painter Agnolo Bronzino's allegory with Venus and Cupid, painted around 1545 and now displayed in the National Gallery in London, is one of the most formally accomplished and the most intellectually complex paintings of the entire Mannerist period, combining a representation of erotic subject matter of considerable explicitness with an allegorical program of considerable obscurity in a work whose combination of formal perfection and interpretive difficulty gives it a specifically Mannerist quality of sophisticated, self-conscious complexity that goes considerably beyond the formal beauty of the individual figures to engage the viewer in an intellectual puzzle whose specific solution has never been definitively established. The painting was produced for Cosimo de' Medici as a gift for King Francis I of France, and its combination of erotic appeal and intellectual depth was presumably calculated to appeal to the specific tastes of a patron who prided himself on the sophistication of his cultural judgment and who had assembled at Fontainebleau most distinguished collection of Italian Mannerist art available north of the Alps. The specific intellectual content of the allegory, whatever precisely it was part of the painting's appeal to a patron who valued the demonstration of learning as much as the demonstration of beauty. The artist and goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini's casting of the bronze Perseus with the head of Medusa, commissioned by Cosimo I de' Medici and installed in the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence in 1554, where it remains today, represents one of the supreme achievements of 16th century bronze casting, and a work whose combination of technical virtuosity, formal elegance, and dramatic narrative content makes it the most celebrated single bronze sculpture of the Italian Renaissance after Donatello's David. Cellini described the dramatic circumstances of the final casting in his autobiography, the furnace overheating, the metal solidifying prematurely, his desperate decision to melt down his own pewter dishes to provide additional material, and the eventual triumph as the mold was completely filled in one of the most vivid accounts of the physical and emotional drama of the creative process available in any artist's memoir, and the specific quality of the excitement and the relief he describes is entirely consistent with the extraordinary quality of the finished work, whose perfect surface and flawless execution give no indication of the crisis that accompanied its production. The Renaissance concept of fame, the conviction that the artist's work could achieve a permanence and an immortality through the quality of its achievement that time and mortality could not entirely destroy, was one of the primary motivating forces behind the extraordinary ambition and the extraordinary effort that the most celebrated artists of the period invested in their work, and the specific idea that the artist's name could survive the death of the individual who bore it through the continued existence and the continued admiration of the works they had produced gave Renaissance art a specific, the relationship to the concept of personal immortality that distinguished it fundamentally from the medieval tradition in which individual artistic identity was typically subordinated to the collective service of God and the Church. The specific formulation of this idea in the ancient Roman tradition, most influentially in Horace's claim that he had built a monument more lasting than bronze, in his poetry, provided Renaissance artists and theorists with the precise classical authority for their conviction that artistic achievement could confer a form of immortality on its creator, and the systematic celebration of artistic genius that characterizes Renaissance biographies, from Vasari's Lives to Condivi's Life of Michelangelo, reflects the degree to which this conviction had become one of the organizing principles of the Renaissance understanding of art and of the artist's social role. The Italian Renaissance's influence on European music, literature, and philosophy was as profound and as far-reaching as its influence on the visual arts, and the specific cultural achievements of the period in these non-visual domains were, in many cases, as consequential for the subsequent development of Western civilization as the paintings, sculptures, and buildings that are the most immediately visible legacy of the Renaissance tradition. The development of humanist scholarship, the recovery of ancient philosophical texts, the invention of printing and its implications for the distribution of knowledge, the creation of the modern concept of the individual as a subject of moral and intellectual significance in their own right, and the specific forms of lyric poetry, vernacular prose narrative, and theatrical performance that emerged from the Renaissance engagement with ancient models, all contributed to the creation of the cultural conditions within which the specific achievements of Renaissance art were produced, and within which their significance can be most completely understood. The visual arts were one among many interconnected fields of cultural production whose interaction and mutual influence gave the Renaissance its specific character as a moment of total cultural transformation rather than simply a period. Artistic achievement. The transfer of Renaissance ideas and Renaissance formal conventions to the New World through the work of Spanish and Portuguese missionaries and colonial administrators who brought European artistic objects, European artists, and European artistic training to the Americas in the decades following the discovery and conquest of the continents, produced in the 16th and 17th centuries a range of hybrid artistic traditions that combine the formal vocabulary of the European Renaissance with the visual cultures of the indigenous populations of Mexico, Peru, and the other regions of the Americas that European colonialism had incorporated into the broader world that Renaissance civilization was in the process of creating. The specific character of the colonial Baroque style that developed in Latin America, with its combination of European architectural and pictorial conventions with indigenous decorative motifs, indigenous material cultures, and indigenous visual traditions, gives one of the most vivid illustrations of the creative possibilities of cultural encounter that the Renaissance's global reach opened up. Even as the specific conditions of that encounter, the violence of conquest, the destruction of indigenous cultures, the exploitation of enslaved and colonized populations were among the darkest chapters in the history of the civilization that the Renaissance had done so much to create. The concept of Renaissance humanism, which placed the study of the ancient classical world at the center of its educational program, and the dignity and the potential of the individual human being at the center of its philosophical vision, represented not only an intellectual revolution of the first importance, but a fundamental shift in the understanding of what art was for and what artists were. A shift from the medieval understanding of the visual arts as a craft in the service of the church to the Renaissance understanding of painting and sculpture as liberal arts, in which the exercise of individual creative intelligence was the primary source of value and the primary basis of the artist's claim to social recognition and cultural authority. The specific consequences of this shift for the social position of artists, for the economic conditions under which art was produced, for the intellectual content of artistic programs, and for the critical vocabulary through which art was discussed and evaluated, were so far-reaching and so fundamental that they constitute in themselves a revolution in the understanding of visual culture, whose effects have been felt continuously from the 15th century to the present day. The Renaissance ended not with a single decisive event, but with a gradual transformation of its central values and its central formal conventions into the different but related artistic culture of the Baroque, a transformation that occurred at different rates in different parts of Europe, and that left behind in each national tradition a specific legacy of Renaissance formal conventions and Renaissance intellectual values that continued to shape artistic production long after the specific historical conditions of the Renaissance itself had passed. The specific quality of the Renaissance legacy, its emphasis on the dignity of the human individual, its conviction that the study of the ancient world offered the most reliable guide to the full development of human potential, its belief that art could achieve a permanence and a significance that transcended the mortality of the individual artists who produced it, remained as formative for the subsequent development of Western civilization as any of the specific formal achievements that the period produced, and the conversation between the Renaissance tradition and the cultures that have engaged with it across the 5 centuries since the period's end is one of the longest and the most productive in the history of human thought. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence, which holds the most comprehensive collection of Italian Renaissance painting available in any single institution in the world, and which was built by Giorgio Vasari between 1560 and 1580 as an administrative building for the Florentine state before being converted into a public gallery by the Medici in the 17th century, provides the most complete single institution survey of Renaissance painting from its earliest phase in the works of Cimabue and Giotto through the mature achievements of Botticelli, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael to the Mannerist departures of Pontormo and Bronzino that is available anywhere in the world. The experience of moving through the Uffizi's long corridor of galleries, passing from room to room through 5 centuries of Italian painting, from the Byzantine gold of the earliest works to the increasingly rich and increasingly atmospheric colour of the later 16th century, with the specific formal developments of each generation, visible in direct comparison with what preceded and what followed, gives one of the most complete and the most instructive experiences of the development of the Renaissance. Tradition that any museum visit can provide, and the collection's quality across the full span of the period it covers, has no equivalent in any other institution. The Renaissance left behind a world transformed its cities enriched by buildings of extraordinary beauty and formal ambition, its collections filled with paintings and sculptures that had established new standards of human achievement, its libraries stocked with the recovered texts of antiquity and the new humanist scholarship that had grown from their study, and its intellectual culture shaped by ideas about the individual, about nature, about the past, and about the relationship between human creativity and divine creation that would continue to generate new questions and new answers across the centuries that followed. The works it produced are still out there in the museums and the churches and the palaces where they have always been, surrounded by the cities that the Renaissance itself helped to build. In the Uffizi and the Vatican and the Louvre and the National Gallery and the Prado and the dozens of smaller museums across Italy and Europe where the paintings wait in their frames for the next person who will stand before them, and feel, across the distance of 5 or 6 centuries, the specific and irreplaceable quality of a human intelligence working at the fullest reach of its capabilities in the service of beauty, understanding, and the permanent record of what it means to be alive in a specific time and a specific place. You can let all of that go now. There is nothing left to study or to admire or to remember tonight. Somewhere tonight the dome of Brunelleschi is pale against the Florentine sky, and the Arno is moving quietly beneath its bridges, and the painted walls of the old palaces are still in the darkness, and the night is deep and full of rest.